Solomon Islands, August 1942. Dawn leaks through a curtain of tropical haze. The jungle hums, heat rises from the crushed coral of Henderson Field American ground crews, drenched in sweat and aviation fuel. Move like ghosts under the still orange sky. Engines cough to life-twin Allison V-1710s. Growling in unison, the sound doesn't roar. It tears the morning open. From the eastern edge of the runway, strange silhouettes roll forward sleek. Silver machines, twin booms, split by a narrow cockpit pod, the men of the 339th Fighter Squadron call them Lightnings to the watching Marines. They look alien to the Japanese reconnaissance pilots orbiting above. They look impossible. Moments later, the P-38s rise off the coral strip, their tails gleaming like blades in the new sun. Below them lies the tangle of jungle and reef, the Solomon's Chain, a scattered battleground between two empires. Far north, Japanese pilots are already forming up over Bougainville. They think they know every American plane. They're about to meet one they can't forget. By mid-1942, the Pacific was a chessboard soaked in blood and salt. 6 months had passed since the attack on Pearl Harbor, and Japan's empire had stretched across half the ocean, from the Philippines to New Guinea, from Hong Kong to Rabaul. The rising sun flew over vast territories captured in a lightning storm of offensives. America, still reeling from the December shock, was clawing its way back into the fight. The Japanese Navy ruled the seas, its pilots elite, experienced. Lethal had swept aside almost every Allied aircraft they met. The Zero, the Mitsubishi A-6M, was unmatched in agility and range, dominating skies from the Indian Ocean to the Coral Sea. To the Japanese command, air superiority seemed secure. Their eyes were now fixed on a narrow island chain that stretched like a broken spear across the South Pacific, the Solomon Islands. For the Allies, that chain meant everything. Control it, and they could protect the sea routes to Australia, preserve communication lines, and launch a counteroffensive northward. Lose it, and the Japanese could choke the South Pacific lifeline, isolate Australia, and threaten the American West Coast itself. In May 1942, the Battle of the Coral Sea had halted Japan's southern advance for the first time a month later. Midway had turned the tide at sea, but not yet in the air, while Japanese carrier strength waned. Their land-based forces still struck with brutal reach from their fortress at Rabaul, on the island of New Britain. From there, hundreds of aircraft could sweep down upon the Solomons, hammering any Allied foothold before it took root. That foothold came in August 1942. Under the code name Operation Watchtower, U.S. Marines stormed Guadalcanal, seizing a half-built Japanese airstrip that would become Henderson Field. It was the first American offensive of the Pacific War, and it stunned Tokyo within days. Japanese commanders ordered relentless counterattacks. Waves of bombers and fighters roared down from Rabaul and Bougainville, determined to erase the invaders. But the Americans refused to leave. The struggle for the Solomons became a daily rhythm of thunder. At dawn, air raid sirens. By noon, dogfights twisting through clouds. At dusk, bombers limping home over smoking jungles. It was here, above the tangled green canopy of the South Pacific, that air combat evolved from myth to modern science. And it was here that America's airmen realized something alarming: most of their fighters couldn't keep up. The Bell P-39 Airacobra, used by Marine and Army pilots early in the campaign, was fast but short-legged. The Grumman Wildcats of the Navy could dogfight, but their range was limited to carrier decks against the nimble Japanese Zeros. American pilots were often outclimbed, outearned, and outranged. Something had to change. Behind the lines in the factories of Burbank, California, and the training fields of Australia, a new machine was waiting. Its design was radical: twin engines, twin tails, long legs for escort and interception, and the power to strike deep into enemy skies. Its name, the Lockheed P-38 Lightning. By mid-1942, a few squadrons had begun receiving them. They were complex, expensive, and unlike anything most pilots had flown before to some officers. The P-38 looked too unconventional, too heavy for dogfights, but its speed over 400 miles per hour, its climb rate, and its ability to fly vast distances would soon redefine the air war. The Solomons would be its proving ground. In late August, the first Lightnings arrived. In the South Pacific they were deployed under 13th Air Force and attached to fighter groups supporting Guadalcanal. Pilots began training missions over the deep blue waters between Espiritu Santo, Ifate, and Guadalcanal. Their task, to intercept Japanese bombers before they could reach the Marines' fragile outpost. Few knew it then, but a new chapter of aerial warfare was about to begin, one in which the hunter could finally reach the hunted. The Japanese, confident in their zero supremacy, had no idea what awaited them. They would soon face an aircraft faster, stronger, and deadlier than anything they had ever fought, a machine that would haunt their reports under a single phrase: Nino Oya Oni, the two-tailed devil. By September 1942, the Solomons were a furnace. Every sunrise brought the same sound: the wailing climb of radial engines over the jungle, the metallic thunder of anti-aircraft fire, and the distant rumble of bombs falling into the sea. The fight for air supremacy over Guadalcanal had become a daily duel between two air forces separated by only a few hundred miles and an entire philosophy of warfare. From Rabaul, Japan launched the 11th Air Fleet, a formidable force of Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers escorted by the deadliest 6M0. Their routes ran south across Bougainville and the narrow straits to strike at Henderson Field, the lifeline of American ground troops below. From Henderson, the newly formed Cactus Air Force scrambled whatever could fly: F-4F Wildcats, SBD Dauntlesses, P-400s, Export Airacobras, and a handful of P-38 Lightnings that had only just arrived from the rear areas of the South Pacific Command. Those first Lightnings were part of the 39th and 339th Fighter Squadrons. Under the 347th Fighter Group, they were based initially on New Caledonia and Espiritu Santo, far to the south, until forward strips closer to the front were carved from coral and mud. Their mission was escort and interception, to hunt the bombers that threatened Guadalcanal's fragile perimeter. Each sortie was a lesson in endurance. The distances were vast. From Espiritu Santo to Guadalcanal and back was nearly 1,000 miles of ocean and jungle, a journey no single-engine fighter could make. But the P-38's twin engines and long-range fuel tanks allowed it to bridge that deadly gap. For the first time, the Americans could challenge Japanese formations long before they reached the target. Still, conditions were brutal. Pilots flew in suffocating heat, through sudden tropical squalls. Often without radio contact or reliable navigation, magnetic compasses drifted over the equator, and cloud towers rose 40,000 feet high. One mistake could mean running out of fuel over open ocean, a death sentence in shark-infested waters. At the same time, Japanese pilots were operating at the edge of their endurance too. Their bases at Kahili, Balliol, and Buka were closer to Guadalcanal, but under constant pressure from American naval bombardment. Each mission demanded long flights over open water, heavy fuel loads, and tense minutes over enemy airspace. Losses were mounting, and replacements, especially experienced ones, were growing scarce. But Tokyo's doctrine left no room for retreat. The Imperial Japanese Navy believed in the offensive spirit, Seishin, and saw withdrawal as dishonor, even as the attrition rate climbed. Commanders ordered more raids. They believed American pilots lacked the skill and nerve to stand against Japan's elite flyers. Then, on a quiet morning late in September, their confidence began to crack. That day, A formation of Betty bombers, escorted by Zeros, swept down toward Guadalcanal as they crossed the northern horizon. Contrails appeared far above them, faint silver streaks against the blue. The Japanese formation leader, Lieutenant Saburo Shindo, thought they were high-flying reconnaissance planes. But the streaks moved too fast. Within minutes, the formation was in chaos. Twin-engine fighters, unlike anything seen before, dove from altitude at incredible speed. Their attack was silent until the guns opened heavy .50 caliber. Shells ripped into the bomber formation. Pilots who tried to climb found the newcomers already above them. Those who dove found the pursuers still closing in. The bombers broke and scattered. Zeros attempted to intercept, but couldn't match the attackers' speed or climb in mere minutes. Several Bettys were falling in flames toward the sea. The Japanese pilots, stunned, returned to Rabaul with the first rumors: enemy twin-tailed fighters that could dive like hawks and vanish into the clouds. The phrase spread through the mess halls and briefings: Nano Oya Oni, the two-tailed devils. For American intelligence, the results were validation. The Lightning's design, once doubted, had proven its worth in its first real test. Its speed and altitude advantage allowed hit-and-run attacks that Japanese pilots couldn't counter. Once invincible Zeros were suddenly being hunted. Yet the Solomons' air war was far from won. Every new day brought counterstrikes, ambushes, and attrition on both sides. The P-38s were still few in number, and their pilots were learning in combat what manuals could never teach: how to fight in the tropics, how to conserve fuel, how to live through their first dive against an enemy ace. War, for all its machinery and thunder, always comes down to people, those inside the cockpits, clutching the stick with trembling hands, staring at dials fogged by sweat. In the Solomons, that truth was written in the faces of pilots barely in their 20s, sent to fight in skies that could kill as quickly as the enemy could. For the American pilots of the 347th Fighter Group, the arrival of the P-38 Lightning felt like a leap into the future. They had trained on outdated aircraft, flown in underpowered P-39s and P-400s that struggled at altitude. Now, the cockpit canopy of the Lightning offered a new view of war: wide, clear, modern. Yet with that power came responsibility. The aircraft was complex, temperamental, and dangerous to those who didn't understand her, managing two engines, superchargers, and counter-rotating propellers demanded calm precision, the kind only experience could build. Among these men was Major John Mitchell, who would later lead the famed interception mission that killed Admiral Yamamoto. But here, in the early Solomons days, he was just another officer trying to teach his squadron how to survive. He drilled his men relentlessly. Use your speed. Not your turn. The P-38 could climb higher and dive faster than anything the Japanese had, but only if pilots resisted the instinct to dogfight like in the movies. That lesson was hard-earned. Young pilots fresh from the States often wanted glory. They rolled into turns with Zeros, forgetting that agility was the enemy's greatest weapon. The results were tragic. More than one Lightning went down in flames. Its advantage wasted slowly. Through loss and endurance, tactics began to change. Altitude became armor, speed became survival. Flying from half-flooded runways on Guadalcanal, eating rations out of tins, sleeping under mosquito nets, they began to understand that the war in the Pacific was not glamorous, it was endurance. Each mission meant hours over open water, scanning for the faint shimmer of enemy wings. If an engine failed, there was no rescue. They joked in the tents that the ocean was deeper than the sky was high, and yet morale held. There was something almost poetic about the Lightning, its twin tails slicing through the clouds, a symbol of reach and resilience. When those silver machines took off at dawn, even the ground crew stopped to watch. They knew those pilots were flying not just for the island, but for the idea that technology and courage together could turn the tide. For the Japanese airmen based at Rabaul Kahili and Balale, the Solomons were a test of another kind. They had been raised in the Bushido code, the way of the warrior, where victory came from skill, discipline, and the purity of spirit. Most of them were veterans of China and the early Pacific campaigns, men who had never known defeat in the air. The Zero was their sword, and they wielded it with absolute faith. That faith began to waver the first time they faced the P-38. Reports from returning pilots were met with disbelief. Impossible. Some commanders said, no twin-engine plane can climb like that. But the combat reports didn't lie this strange. Twin-tailed aircraft could appear from 30,000 feet, strike, and vanish. Zeros that tried to follow into a dive saw their wings tear from the strain. The Japanese pilots, trained in close maneuvering combat, suddenly faced an opponent who refused to play by the old rules. For men like Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's most respected aces, these changes were deeply unsettling. Sakai wrote later that he could feel the tempo of the air war shifting. The enemy's machines were no longer sluggish or predictable. They were fast, disciplined, almost mechanical in their precision. The P-38 represented a different philosophy, victory through speed, altitude, and firepower, not through acrobatics or spirit. Within the Japanese command, frustration began to build. Field reports used phrases like beyond reach, too fast to engage, and attacks from impossible altitude, yet pilots were still ordered to confront them. Often in under-maintained aircraft, with limited fuel and worn engines, losses mounted quietly, eroding the myth of invincibility that had carried Japan through 1941 and 1942. While men fought and bled, leadership on both sides adapted in real time. On the American side, General George C. Kenney, commander of the Allied Air Forces in the Southwest Pacific, saw the P-38 as the spearhead of a new kind of warfare, long-range precision interception. He pushed for more Lightnings, more fuel, more forward bases, and insisted on tactical flexibility. His doctrine emphasized altitude advantage and teamwork over individual heroics. Under his influence, Lightning squadrons learned to coordinate strikes, use radio communication effectively, and exploit radar intelligence, tools the Japanese largely lacked. On the Japanese side, the 11th Air Fleet began experimenting with high-altitude cover flights and new formations, but strategic doctrine remained rigid. The culture of Kessen, decisive battle, encouraged boldness even when conditions favored withdrawal. Pilots were expected to die rather than disengage, a bravery that often turned suicidal against faster, heavier-armed opponents. Even as commanders like Rear Admiral Junichi Kusaka recognized the growing technological gap, Japan's strained industry could not produce an answer quickly enough. The war in the air had changed. The Solomons became not only a battlefield, but a laboratory, a place where courage met science, and where leadership met understanding the future before it arrived. Before the P-38 Lightning arrived, air combat over the Solomons had followed a predictable pattern. Japanese Zeros climbed higher, waited for American raids, and then pounced in tight-turning dogfights, a style inherited from the biplane era. It was elegant and deadly, but it demanded proximity. It also relied on the opponent accepting that kind of fight. The P-38 refused to play that game. Its pilots were trained to fight with energy, not agility. They stayed high, using their turbo-supercharged engines to reach altitudes Zeros couldn't match from there. They struck like falcons, a single vertical dive, guns blazing, followed by a high-speed climb away before the enemy could respond. This was boom and zoom warfare, the embodiment of altitude as power. Japanese pilots tried to turn inside the Lightnings, but the Americans simply didn't turn. They used gravity and horsepower, not grace and seconds. The battle geometry changed forever. The Lightning's twin engines offered something else: survivability. A single hit that might cripple a P-39 or Wildcat meant little to a P-38 pilot. He could fly home on one engine in a theater where every downed plane meant a pilot lost to the ocean or jungle. That redundancy was revolutionary. Tactically, it allowed aggression. Pilots could push further, dive faster, take chances others avoided. By the end of 1942, Japanese air controllers at Rabaul began recording a new pattern, bomber formations being hit earlier. Higher and harder for the first time, their escort Zeros were on the defensive. The P-38 Lightning was born in Lockheed's design rooms in 1937. Years before the U.S. entered the war, it was an aircraft ahead of its time. Twin engines, tricycle landing gear, turbo superchargers, and heavy centralized armament mounted in the nose. That armament, one 20mm cannon and 450 caliber Browning machine guns, all fired along the same line, eliminating convergence issues that plagued wing-mounted guns. A single burst from a Lightning could shred a bomber at half a mile against the lightly built Japanese aircraft. It was devastating. Its counter-rotating propellers canceled torque, allowing smoother control at high speeds. Its turbo superchargers, mounted in the tail booms, gave it the ability to maintain power well above 25,000 feet, the altitude where Japanese engines began to gasp. And its range, over 1,100 miles with drop tanks, allowed it to patrol the vast Pacific distances that no other fighter could cover. Yet the Lightning wasn't easy to love. Its cockpit baked in tropical heat. Compressibility, a mysterious aerodynamic phenomenon, caused the nose to lock downward in steep dives until engineers developed dive recovery flaps. Early pilots called it the coffin corner. But necessity breeds mastery. In the Solomons, the P-38's strengths mattered more than its flaws. It could fly farther, climb higher, and strike harder. Every sortie expanded the Allies' reach. Every surviving pilot brought back data that refined tactics for the next mission. For Japanese engineers, the sight of the twin-tailed silhouette was unnerving. Their own twin-engine fighter projects, like the Ki-45 Toryu, couldn't match its speed. They had no high-altitude equivalent. By 1943, intercepted radio chatter revealed frustration among Japanese pilots who simply called it that impossible plane. When the first detailed intelligence reports on the Lightning reached Rabaul's command headquarters, disbelief gave way to fear. Japanese analysts had assumed that twin-engine aircraft were bombers or heavy fighters. Slow, clumsy targets. The Lightning shattered that assumption. Its speed of over 400 miles per hour and ability to climb past 35,000 feet made it the first true long-range interceptor in the Pacific. Interrogations of captured pilots later revealed how profound the shock had been. One officer described his first encounter. "It came out of the sun at a speed I did not think possible. The bomber beside me exploded before I could even move my stick." Others recalled seeing tracers coming not from behind, but from above, a new angle of attack that broke their formation discipline. The Japanese air doctrine, perfected over China and the early Pacific, was built on agility and teamwork in turning fights. The Lightning forced them into vertical combat. They were unequipped to win. Morale began to erode. Reports from Bougainville in early 1943 described pilots refusing to engage unless they held altitude advantage. The phrase "fork-tailed devil," "nenai no oya oni," spread like superstition. Half respect, half fear. In diaries recovered after the war, some pilots admitted believing the P-38 was flown by elite Americans with iron nerves and unending fuel. Even Japanese propaganda, usually triumphant, avoided mentioning it by name. Every technological leap in warfare raises an old question. Does progress make killing easier or surviving harder? For the men of the Solomons, the Lightning embodied that paradox. It was a savior and a predator, a machine that could protect a convoy or destroy a dozen lives in a minute. American pilots learned to respect the enemy they hunted. Many had seen Zeros plunge into the sea without parachutes, the result of a code that forbade surrender. It changed them. The young men who had once joked about bagging Zeeks grew quieter. They understood that each silhouette falling in flames carried a story, a family, a belief. Yet war did not allow sentiment. The P-38's efficiency made the air war more brutal, and less personal battles became numbers, altitudes, fuel states, kill ratios. Victory was measured in tonnage and sorties, not in faces remembered. For Japanese airmen, the moral weight was different. They faced the realization that courage alone could not stop a machine born from a different industrial world. Some continued to fight with fatalistic pride. Others wrote farewell notes before each mission, expecting not to return. The sky had become mechanical, and human spirit was no longer enough to rule it. By early 1943, both sides understood the Solomons were not just another campaign. They were the birthplace of a new era in aerial combat, where science and courage merged, and where the fork-tailed devil became both symbol and sentence. But history's turning points are never declared in the moment. They are written in a single day, a single battle, when everything learned and feared collides at once. And that day, when Japanese pilots met the full wrath of the Lightning over the Solomons, was about to arrive. The sky above the central Solomons was a layered haze of sunlight and distant thunderheads at 20,000 feet. A formation of Mitsubishi G-4M Betty bombers pushed southward from Rabaul. Escorted by nearly 40 A-6 M0s, their target was the lifeline of the American offensive, Henderson Field. Still scarred by months of shelling but alive with the hum of aircraft and the grit of determination. Below, radar posts on Guadalcanal's ridges picked up the incoming swarm. The warning echoed through field phones. Raid north, multiple contacts. Altitude 20,000. Ground crews froze mid-task. Pilots sprinted for their planes. Dust rose as P-38s, P-39s, and F-4FS powered up in sequence, engines snarling against the humidity. This wasn't the first Japanese raid of the month, but something about this one was different. It was larger, better organized, more determined, as if Tokyo meant to prove that the Solomons were still theirs. From the southern tip of the island chain, 12 Lockheed P-38 Lightnings of the 339th Fighter Squadron lifted off in staggered pairs. Their leader was Captain Thomas "Tommy" Lanphier, a calm, deliberate pilot with a reputation for patience, a rare trait in the chaos of the Pacific. His wingman, Lt. Rex Barber, was younger, aggressive, and hungry for combat. Between them, they had logged hundreds of patrol hours, but few direct engagements of this scale. As they climbed, condensation trailed from their twin booms, silver arcs rising through blue. Their orders were simple: intercept and break the raid before it reached Henderson. Lanphier's formation reached 30,000 feet, positioning themselves above the oncoming Japanese column. Through the glare of morning light, they could see the faint shimmer of sunlight glinting off the bomber's fuselages far to the north. 20 dots. Escorted by what looked like a cloud of gnats. Lanphier keyed his mic. Lightning lead to all flights, maintain altitude. We strike from above, one pass only, make it count. His men acknowledged then, throttles forward. At 0920 hours, the P-38s fell upon the Japanese formation. The attack began with silence, no warning, no radio chatter. Just the whistle of air across wings as the Lightnings entered their dive. The Japanese escort had no time to react. Tracer fire erupted from the nose-mounted guns of the P-38s. Converging into the bomber stream, 2 Bettys burst into flames almost instantly. Their fuel tanks igniting mid-air shrapnel, and smoke filled the sky. The Zeros scattered in panic, trying to climb into position, but the Americans were already gone. Diving, rolling, climbing again in a pattern too fast to follow. The boom and zoom doctrine was in full display. Within minutes, chaos consumed the formation. Japanese gunners fired blindly. The Lightnings weaved through the debris field, their engines roaring like thunder. A Zero attempted to intercept one P-38 in a vertical climb. A fatal mistake, the American pilot cut throttle. Pulled hard, and the twin 50s found their mark. The Zero disintegrated in a cloud of fragments. Above, Lanfear and Barber looped around for another pass. Their speed gave them time and space. In seconds, they dove again, aiming for the center of the formation. Lanfear's cannons found another bomber. Shredding its fuselage, the plane broke in half mid-air, its wings folding as it plunged toward the sea. Japanese pilots, stunned by the sheer velocity of the attack, resorted to desperate maneuvers. They tried to lure the Americans into turning duels, hoping to exploit their superior agility, but the P-38s simply refused. They climbed back into the sun, regrouped, and dove again. Every engagement lasted seconds. Every second, another aircraft fell. By 0940, the battle had drifted south toward New Georgia Sound, later called the Slot. The Japanese bomber formation was shattered. Those that survived jettisoned their bombs and fled north. The Zeros, forced to cover the retreat, found themselves chased by Lightnings that could outclimb them, even on damaged engines. From the ground, Marines at Henderson watched streaks of smoke twisting across the sky. They didn't know the details, but they could tell something extraordinary was happening. Later, one observer wrote, "It looked like the heavens were tearing themselves apart. You could see two-tailed fighters diving through explosions. And for once, it wasn't our boys falling." When the battle finally broke off, 9 Japanese bombers and 5 fighters were confirmed destroyed, at the cost of 1 P-38. But the numbers didn't tell the whole story. This was the first time a large Japanese air assault on Guadalcanal had been broken before reaching its target. Henderson Field remained untouched that morning, silent proof that the balance in the air had shifted. At Rabaul, the returning Japanese pilots struggled to explain what had happened. Their after-action reports described twin-tailed, high-speed fighters attacking from great altitude. One officer noted that the enemy planes seemed to dive vertically and vanish. Japanese intelligence officers dismissed some of these reports as exaggeration, but as more pilots repeated the same stories, disbelief turned to alarm. The commander of the 11th Air Fleet, Vice Admiral Junichi Kusaka, received the summary report that afternoon. His staff annotated it with a single phrase: "New American fighter, twin tail. Extraordinary speed, immediate countermeasures required." There were no countermeasures. The Zero's design, brilliant in 1940, was now showing its age. It lacked armor, self-sealing tanks, and power at altitude. No amount of skill could offset the technological gap. The shock among pilots was not only strategic, it was personal, for men trained to believe in the supremacy of spirit. The realization that an enemy machine could not only match but surpass them was deeply unsettling. That day, over the Solomons, the legend of the fork-tailed devil was born in truth and terror. In the humid dusk, officers of the Imperial Japanese Navy gathered in silence around a coded dispatch. It came from Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, the architect of Pearl Harbor himself. His words were brief: inspection of forward bases in the Solomons. April 18th. Arrival 0935. It was a routine morale mission, a gesture of confidence to his weary pilots. But in war, even confidence could be fatal. American cryptanalysts at Station HYPO, working from a cramped basement on Pearl Harbor, intercepted and decrypted the message within hours. The details were astonishingly precise: times, routes, aircraft types. For Admiral Chester Nimitz, this was a gift of fate and an unbearable dilemma. To act on the information meant revealing to the Japanese that their codes were broken. To ignore it meant allowing the man who planned Pearl Harbor to live. The decision fell to Admiral William F. Halsey in the South Pacific. His answer was cold, decisive, and perfectly measured. Get Yamamoto. The mission would be entrusted to the same machines that had already stunned the Japanese, the Lockheed P-38 Lightning. Only the Lightning, with its twin engines and long-range tanks, could make the 1,000-mile round trip from Guadalcanal to Bougainville and back. At Henderson Field, Major John Mitchell of the 339th Fighter Squadron assembled a team of 18 pilots. They were briefed in absolute secrecy. On a rough map pinned to a tent wall, Mitchell traced a line from Guadalcanal, skirting the waves barely above sea level, to intercept at a precise time, 0935, near Bougainville's southwest coast. The Japanese itinerary predicted Yamamoto's G-4M Betty bombers would arrive almost to the minute. Every calculation mattered: fuel, altitude, sun position, even wind direction. A 2-minute error could doom the mission. The Lightnings would fly at wave-top height for 430 miles, invisible to Japanese radar, then climb at the last moment for the kill. April 18, 1943, 07:00 hours. The P-38S roared to life. Engines growling through the morning mist of Guadalcanal ground crews lined the strip silently. Only a handful knew what was at stake. They took off one by one, the twin tails catching glints of gold light as they banked eastward over the ocean below. The water stretched endless and still above. The pilots fought the monotony of the low-level flight, eyes fixed on their leader's wingtips. Throttles steady, instruments trembling at the edge of endurance. Each minute brought them closer to Yamamoto's incoming formation, flying from Rabaul with 2 bombers and 6 Zero escorts. At 0934, right on schedule, the Lightnings reached the intercept point over Bougainville's jungle. They began to climb. Moments later, black specks appeared ahead. 2 bombers gliding along the coast, with the faint silver flash of Zeros above them. Mitchell keyed his radio. There they are, let's go. 4 Lightnings surged upward to cover against the escorts. The rest, led by Captain Thomas Lanphier and Lt. Rex Barber, arrowed straight for the bombers. Lanphier rolled inverted, diving from above the lid formation, his tracers slashed across the sky. Tearing into the escorting Zeros, Barber, flying lower, focused on the first bomber, the one believed to carry Yamamoto. He pulled into firing position, lined up his sights, and squeezed the trigger. A burst from his .50 caliber guns ripped through the Betty's right engine. Smoke trailed instantly. Seconds later, the bomber banked sharply, losing altitude. Observers on the ground later reported seeing it spiral into the jungle, exploding in a fireball among the trees. The second bomber tried to escape along the coastline. Pursued by another pair of Lightnings, it too was hit, crashing into the sea near Moila Point. The Zeros fought fiercely, diving and rolling in defense, but the P-38s refused to linger. Their mission was not air superiority, it was execution. Within 10 minutes it was done. By 0945, the Americans were already turning for home. They had been over enemy territory less than 15 minutes, yet the cost and consequence of their raid would echo across the entire Pacific. Back in the jungle below, Japanese search parties reached the smoldering wreckage by midday. The bodies of the crew were found near the shattered fuselage, still tangled in their harnesses. Among them lay Admiral Yamamoto, upright, still in his seat, one white-gloved hand resting on his katana. He had been killed instantly, a bullet through the head. His watch had stopped at 0935. The discovery was devastating. Yamamoto had been more than a commander. He was the symbol of Japan's naval pride, the strategist who had once been untouchable. His death, at the precise time he had announced to the minute, felt like a cruel twist of fate. The Lightnings landed at Henderson Field at 1800 hours, nearly out of fuel. They taxied in silence. Only after shutdown did anyone speak. Lanphier and Barber exchanged brief glances, each claiming the fatal burst, but the moment was subdued. Their commander, Major Mitchell, simply nodded the mission had succeeded. The price of secrecy remained. In Washington, the news was celebrated in silence. President Roosevelt was informed through a classified cable, "Yamamoto is dead." Publicly, the United States announced nothing. Japan, however, could not hide it. On May 21st, Tokyo radio broadcast the death of Admiral Yamamoto. Calling it a heroic passing in battle, the Japanese nation went into mourning. The Americans went back to work. Operation Vengeance was more than revenge for Pearl Harbor. It proved that American intelligence, logistics, and air power could coordinate across thousands of miles of hostile ocean. For Japan, it was a psychological wound that never truly healed. The loss of Yamamoto deprived the Imperial Navy of its most pragmatic voice, one who had warned his government years earlier, "In the first 6 months, I will run wild. But after that, I have no expectation of success." Those 6 months had passed. The war he predicted was beginning to consume his own nation. The death of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto sent a quiet shock through the Japanese high command, not a loud collapse, but a hollow silence that reached from Rabaul to Tokyo in every naval wardroom. In every airbase across the Pacific, men lowered their heads in disbelief. Yamamoto had been more than a commander. He was the architect of Japan's early victories, the mind that had shaped Pearl Harbor, the Coral Sea, and Midway. His death wasn't just a loss of leadership. It was the loss of confidence. For the pilots of the Imperial Navy, already battered by attrition, the event carried an almost spiritual weight. Rumors spread like smoke that he had foreseen his own death, that the gods had called him home, that no man could lead Japan to victory now. But behind the myth and mourning, the practical consequences were immediate and severe. By mid-1943, the Solomon Islands campaign had drained Japan's air power. The veterans who had dominated the early Pacific battles were gone, either dead, captured, or too exhausted to fight. New recruits arrived straight from flight schools with barely 100 hours of experience, thrust into the chaos of dogfights against American machines far faster and more durable than the Zeros they flew. The Americans, by contrast, were learning, evolving, and replacing losses at a rate Japan couldn't imagine. P-38 squadrons, once experimental, now operated from every major forward base in the South Pacific: Guadalcanal, New Guinea, Espiritu Santo, striking shipping convoys, escorting bombers, and sweeping the skies clear for advancing troops. Each raid brought the same chilling reports from Japanese survivors: twin-tailed fighter, impossible speed, high climb rate, heavy firepower. To the Allied intelligence community, those reports confirmed what the frontline pilots already knew: Japan's once feared air supremacy had broken. Where the Zero had once ruled the sky, the P-38 now hunted unchallenged. The Lightning's twin-engine design, once considered overcomplicated, became its greatest asset. It could patrol vast distances over open ocean, something no single-engine fighter could safely do from mid-1943 onward. P-38s served not only as interceptors, but also as escort and reconnaissance platforms, extending the Allied reach deep into Japanese-held territory. They flew with cameras instead of guns, mapping the islands that would soon host American invasions. They escorted B-24 Liberators and B-25 Mitchells on raids over Bougainville, Cavien, and Rabaul, where Japanese anti-aircraft fire turned the sky into burning steel. Even when damaged, the P-38's dual engines gave its pilots a fighting chance. One engine could bring a man home from hundreds of miles away. To the Japanese, this endurance seemed unnatural, almost unfair. They called it the Nenaiatsu no Akuma, the two-tailed devil, a name that carried both hatred and awe. It wasn't born from propaganda. It came from the mouths of the pilots who faced it and lived to tell others not to try. By late 1943, Japan's defensive perimeter in the South Pacific began to crumble. The loss of Yamamoto removed the one figure capable of balancing Navy and Army rivalries. In his absence, the Imperial command splintered into competing agendas, each blaming the other for the steady retreat. At sea, American task forces pressed northward. In the air, P-38s cleared the path. The once lethal Japanese Zero now fought from disadvantage, its light frame and lack of armor no match for the heavier, faster Allied designs, P-38s, P-47s, P-51s. Wherever they met, the results were predictable and tragic. Reports from Rabal Kahili and Balail airfields read like obituaries. Entire squadrons vanished in a single sortie. Fuel shortages, tropical diseases, and endless bombing raids left the once proud Japanese air arm grounded, waiting for replacement parts that would never arrive. By the time the Solomons campaign ended in early 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service, the same force that had once darkened the skies over Pearl Harbor, had been reduced to a shadow of itself, the P-38 Lightning. With its eerie twin tail and thunderous presence, had helped carve that shadow. By the dawn of 1944, the Pacific War had changed beyond recognition. Where once Japan's Zero ruled the skies, now formations of P-38 Lightnings, P-47 Thunderbolts, and F-4U Corsairs stretched from horizon to horizon. The Solomons, once a chain of contested islands, had become a vast American air network, fuel depots, repair strips, radar posts, and command centers linked by relentless motion. The transformation wasn't born of luck, it came from planning, steel, and the industrial machine of the United States, a force Japan could never match. Every P-38 that took flight in the Solomons was a symbol of America's wartime mobilization. From Burbank, California, where Lockheed engineers worked around the clock, to the Alaskan and Pacific depots where spare parts arrived by convoy, the Lightning represented an industrial miracle. Each aircraft required more than 50,000 precision parts, 2 turbocharged engines, and a complex twin-boom airframe that few pilots had ever seen before 1942. By 1943, production had reached nearly 500 Lightnings per month, each one fine-tuned for range, climb, and endurance. While Japan struggled to manufacture even basic airframes under constant bombing and blockade, the United States replaced losses faster than they could be counted. Every Lightning shot down over the Solomons was replaced within days. Every pilot lost was replaced by another, better trained, more experienced. This was not only a battle of courage, it was a battle of capacity. And capacity was the one war Japan could not win. With the Solomons secured, Allied strategy shifted. The P-38 Lightning was no longer just an interceptor. It became the spearhead of offensive air operations. Its long range allowed it to escort bombers across the Bismarck Sea, raid Japanese bases in New Guinea, and even strike targets approaching the Marianas. In early 1944, the U.S. 5th Air Force used P-38s to annihilate a Japanese convoy during the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. Dozens of ships were sunk, and hundreds of Japanese troops were lost, a logistical disaster that crippled Japan's ability to reinforce its garrisons. The Lightnings dove through curtains of flak, strafing ships until ammunition ran dry. A surviving Japanese sailor later described the scene. The twin-tailed fighters came like demons. The sea turned white under their fire. No one could look up. Such testimony spread through the Japanese ranks like a warning. For the first time since 1941, Japanese pilots entered combat knowing they were outmatched, not just in speed or firepower, but in the very system that sustained their enemy. The Solomons campaign reshaped how the Allies fought the air war. It taught commanders that control of the sky wasn't merely a tactical advantage. It was the foundation for every amphibious landing, every naval engagement, every mile of advance across the Pacific. The lessons learned by P-38 pilots over Guadalcanal were codified into doctrine. Strike first from altitude. Use teamwork over heroics. Let machines, logistics, and intelligence win the war before the first bullet is fired. By mid-1944, those doctrines guided the island-hopping campaigns of Saipan, Tinian, and Poualiu. Every airfield captured became a forward base for the next assault. Every Lightning sortie brought the war closer to the Japanese homeland. In Tokyo, the Imperial Navy's Intelligence Bureau finally confirmed what its pilots had whispered for months. The Americans had achieved complete operational air superiority over the South Pacific. It was a reality so stark that internal memos referred to it as the air void. Without reconnaissance, Japan's naval movements were blind. Without escort fighters, its bombers were slaughtered. Without fuel, even its remaining aircraft became static targets. The fork-tailed devil had evolved from a weapon into a symbol of reach, of endurance, and of inevitability. By the time the last Japanese garrisons in the Solomons were cut off and left to starve, the Lightning had already moved on to the Philippines, to Iwo Jima, to Okinawa. The skies it once fought to claim now served as stepping stones to the heart of Japan itself. The Solomons were no longer a battleground. They had become a graveyard of empires. In the humid stillness of the South Pacific, the war has long ended. The jungles of Guadalcanal have reclaimed their scars. The runways at Henderson Field lie quiet, grass pushing through coral and concrete. But sometimes, when the wind moves a certain way over the trees, veterans say you can still hear the distant hum of twin engines, the whisper of Lightnings returning home. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning was more than a machine. It was the sound of an industrial nation learning to fight across oceans. It was proof that precision, endurance, and intelligence could overcome zeal and myth. And for the men who flew it, far from home, in skies where every cloud might hide an enemy, it became both sword and shield. For the Japanese pilots who first met it in those burning skies of the Solomons, the memory never faded. They had been raised to believe that courage alone could command the heavens. The fork-tailed devil taught them that the sky had changed, that victory in the modern age would belong not to spirit alone, but to those who could build, think, and adapt. In history's quiet accounting, the Lightning was not the flashiest or the most produced of America's wartime aircraft. Yet it carried the war's most decisive missions: the interception of Yamamoto, the turning of the Solomons, the steady erasure of Japan's air power. Its shape, strange and beautiful, came to embody the balance between human skill and mechanical ingenuity. When the war ended, many of the men who flew P-38s returned to quiet lives. Few spoke often about what they had seen, the fire, the loss, the endless ocean beneath them. But those who remembered would sometimes describe one feeling that never left them: the moment when the engines synchronized, the nose rose, and the world fell away beneath twin silver wings. That was the sound of mastery, not of one nation over another, but of humanity over distance, fear, and limitation. The sky remembers it still, the day men first met the fork-tailed devil, and the day it changed the war forever.